Skeena River, early morning. The forest was damp, the air cold and still, with only the occasional flick of movement from leaves brushing against one another in the breeze. The fishing team had been working along the northern stretch, collecting gear and preparing for the long day ahead when the sound came. An eerie, rhythmic call, deeper than any bird and too consistent for coincidence. At first, they dismissed it as an echo or wildlife chatter common to these dense Canadian woods, but it repeated again. Then again. The tone held too much weight, too much sorrow, and something about it broke the silence in a way none of them could ignore. Elias, the oldest on the crew and the first to recognize the unease, tilted his head toward the sound, his body going still and his eyes narrowing. One by one, the rest followed suit. No one needed to speak. No one joked. The forest had grown quieter, and something in it was wrong. Leaving their gear behind, Elias and two others moved carefully through the underbrush. There was no urgency in their steps, but there was purpose. Something had to be found. As they made their way toward the rising slope that bent sharply above the river, the cries grew more fragmented, as if breath was running out between each call. The smell shifted subtly with the air, mud, crushed bark, and something faintly metallic. A few paces farther, the trees opened into a clearing shadowed by a wide, moss-covered log that had fallen across the narrowest point of the gorge, and under it, barely visible, was the shape of a bear. Her body lay hunched unnaturally, rear legs pinned beneath the weight of the tree. The massive log, slick from last night's rain, had flattened the thick brush beneath it and come down with such force that even the soil looked compressed around her. She was alive. Her sides moved with shallow, uneven breaths, but her body did not stir. There was no attempt to rise, no sound, just the quiet pull and release of breath. A few feet away, just beyond the tree's edge, a cub moved in slow, confused circles, making low, guttural sounds that barely echoed in the stillness. It was too young to know what to do. Its nose twitched with every pass, sometimes brushing the tree, other times moving toward the edge of the gorge before turning back. The movements were nervous but not frantic, like it understood something was wrong but couldn't make sense of why its mother wouldn't move. The silence in the clearing was thick. Elias crouched slowly, eyes on the bear's face. Her eyes were open but heavy, not wild with panic, not wide with pain, just tired, exhausted, waiting. Her paws, once capable of tearing bark from trees, lay unmoving in the mud beneath her chest. One ear twitched slightly at their presence, but she made no other acknowledgement. Her fur was soaked near the hip, matted with mud and streaked with old blood, but the wound wasn't bleeding anymore. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't. It meant she had been like this too long. Elias signaled the others to stay back. One wrong movement, and the mother might attempt to thrash, injuring herself further, or worse, startling the cub into fleeing into the gorge. The stakes were brutally clear. If the bear remained here, she would die. If the cub stayed, it would too. But if they intervened too soon, or without the proper tools, they might kill her in the process. The slope behind the tree was unstable. If the roots gave way or the angle shifted, the log could roll, crushing her chest or driving her off the edge. There was no margin for mistakes. Still crouching, Elias reached slowly for his radio, clicking to the emergency channel. His voice was calm but clipped. Adult grizzly trapped, location confirmed, cub present, mother breathing but immobilized. Requesting rescue response. Equipment needed for heavy lift, medical backup recommended. Estimated arrival, 3 hours, 3 hours. That number lingered. In 3 hours, the bear's breathing could slow. In 3 hours, the cub could wander. Predators could arrive or the tree could shift. Rain was in the forecast and the soil already felt unstable under their boots. 3 hours was both short and too long. Elias scanned the tree's positioning, noting the curve of the roots and the direction of the fallen weight. There might be a way to brace it, climb behind the trunk and wedge something beneath it. But any attempt would carry risk. If she is startled, the bear might lash upward out of instinct, worsening her injuries or driving the cub into panic. The cub, still pacing in tight half circles, gave a softer, shorter call, a mewling sound that ended in a questioning pause. It didn't come closer, but it didn't leave. Its eyes flicked toward the men, unblinking. Then it tucked its legs beneath its small frame and sat beside a patch of flattened grass, breathing softly, watching. Elias took a breath. It was easy to forget, even for trained teams, just how silent real pain can be in the wild. Not every suffering is loud. Sometimes it is only shown in the stillness of a creature that should be moving, the absence of struggle where there should be panic. The mother had stopped fighting hours ago. Maybe because of the weight, maybe because she knew the cub would follow her movements, and a single wrong motion might pull him into danger too. Elias stood carefully and took one step forward, not to touch, not to intervene yet, but to test the space and see if the mother reacted. Her eye moved, following the motion. Her chest rose, nothing more. She didn't lift her head, didn't shift her paws. But she knew. The moment he stepped into that clearing, she knew. He looked back once toward the others, then returned his gaze to the fallen tree. The longer they waited, the narrower their window. Every breath was weaker. Every minute etched a deeper line of fatigue into her body. The cub gave another low whimper, pressing its nose to the log once before retreating again. Elias made up his mind. He would start by bracing the trunk, slow, measured, a shovel, a wedge, and rope from the pack. Nothing loud, nothing sharp. If she could stay calm, if the tree didn't shift too fast, if her spine hadn't been crushed, she might stand again. The odds weren't good, but there was something in the steadiness of her eye, in the way the cub refused to leave, that held them all there, waiting not just for rescue, but for the small, silent miracle that sometimes lives inside the wild. The mother grizzly was lying so still, it was hard to tell at first if she was alive. Wedged beneath a fallen cedar that had snapped during the night storm, her body was half submerged in wet earth near the edge of a ridge that overlooked the Skeena River basin. One massive limb of the tree pressed diagonally across her lower back, pinning her hips against the slope. She hadn't moved in hours. Her breaths came slow and shallow, barely disturbing the wet leaves clinging to her flank. Mud matted her fur and clung to the wounds near her shoulder, but it wasn't the injury that made her so silent. It was the weight of the tree, the pressure it placed on her ribcage and spine, robbing her of strength with each passing minute. A few feet away, the cub paced in small, desperate circles, its coat still puffed with the roundness of youth. The cries that had brought the rangers this far into the forest had come from him. High, insistent, and repetitive. His voice had carried downstream, past the fishing camp, through dense understory and into a ravine too steep for casual hikers. When Elias, a seasoned field ranger, and his team first arrived, the bear cub had tried to run but hadn't gone far. He kept returning, stopping just short of his mother, nose twitching, confused. The rangers, though trained for moments like these, didn't speak for a long time after seeing the scene. Elias knelt slowly near the mother's head, watching her nostrils flare gently. Her eyes opened once, but barely focused. He saw no aggression there, no fear, only fatigue and a kind of distant stillness that felt worse than panic. It meant she had stopped struggling, not because she had accepted help, but because her energy had long since run out. She had likely spent the night trying to move, shift, lift, anything to ease the pressure, but it hadn't worked. Now her body was shutting down. Elias radioed the base team and reported a live adult grizzly, non-aggressive but immobilized, with a dependent cub nearby. He described the terrain as unstable. The tree is too heavy to move without mechanical assistance, and the surrounding slope is at risk for rockslide. The answer came back with a soft crackle. Helicopter unavailable. Equipment en route by foot. Estimated arrival 90 minutes. 90 minutes was too long, but moving too soon could trigger a slide. Any shift in weight could send the slope crumbling toward the drop-off, where both mother and cub could be lost. Elias didn't reply right away. He turned to the others and motioned for them to start stabilizing the perimeter. Ropes were anchored quietly to nearby trees. Soft mats were laid over the mud for better grip. No one spoke louder than necessary. One ranger began assembling a lightweight jack in case the log could be lifted just enough to shift her without injury. But they couldn't attempt that until they were sure her spine wasn't broken. Every decision required balance, speed versus risk, intervention versus observation. A single misstep might do more harm than waiting. The cub pressed his head briefly against the log. His nose twitched, then settled against her shoulder. He made a low sound, not a cry, not a growl, just something uncertain and sad. The mother didn't respond, her ears barely flicked. It was unclear if she even registered the cub's presence anymore, though her body had remained protective during the night. There were no signs of trauma beyond the pinning itself, but the pressure on her torso likely made movement impossible. Elias moved a step closer, kneeling again. He whispered, "It's okay, girl," not expecting a response. But her eyes opened, not wide, just a slow lift of the lids, enough to show she heard, enough to suggest she still knew where she was, still sensed the cub beside her, and still understood the presence of something unfamiliar, human, quiet, and not a threat. It wasn't trust, it wasn't submission, it was recognition maybe, or something close to it. The clouds overhead thickened, and a breeze moved through the trees, bringing with it the scent of moss and rain-soaked bark. The cub walked a few paces, then sat, tail curled tightly, gaze fixed on her unmoving back. She was breathing, but slower now. Her sides no longer rose in rhythm. The delay in help meant the team would need to act as soon as the slope was secure. They had only one chance. If the log was lifted at the wrong angle, it might slide forward and crush her chest. If it rolled backward, it might snap her spine. But if they waited too long, her lungs would give out. Her cub, still too small to fend for himself, would be orphaned. The risk was losing one or losing both. Elias wiped his hands clean against his sleeves, not for sanitation but habit, a small motion to steady his nerves. He spoke quietly into the radio again. Terrain reinforced, team ready, beginning shallow wedge plan. No one replied for a full 5 seconds, and then came a single word. Copy. Around him, the others prepared the jack, the brace, and the angled boards to guide the weight. Every sound, the creak of metal, the shifting of ropes, seemed louder against the silence of the bear's labored breath. The cub stood again, stepping forward, nose pointed toward the noise, then back to his mother. His movement was hesitant and unsteady, but he didn't run. He just waited. That waiting was the hardest part. Everyone knew what was at stake. Everyone moved with care. The mother's life depended on seconds now, and still, no one rushed. Because in the wild, rushing doesn't save lives. Patience, precision, and softness do. And in that fragile moment, with the weight of a forest pressing down on one quiet body, everything that mattered was about not doing more harm. Elias stood at the edge of the unstable slope, the wind stirring faint strands of moss from the surrounding cedar trunks, and watched as the mother bear's breath continued to falter beneath the crushing weight of the fallen log. Her massive flank, matted with damp earth and patches of pine needles, barely moved now. Each shallow inhale rattled through her ribs like wind trapped in a hollow stump. The cub, still pacing anxiously in erratic loops beside her head, had gone silent, its earlier cries now reduced to small, confused grunts as it nuzzled the ground and looked up at the team on the ridge. The others had radioed for support the moment they'd confirmed her state, pinned by a storm-felled cedar that had collapsed during the previous night's rains. But the terrain was treacherous, the forest floor slick from runoff, and no rescue equipment could reach them in time. They had 2 hours, maybe more, before help would arrive. But it was time she didn't have. Elias had seen this before, the slow failure of circulation in animals crushed under pressure. The way hope slipped out minute by minute. A delay would mean death, not from trauma, but from the body simply giving up. Without exchanging words, Elias adjusted the webbing strap across his chest and stepped forward. He was the oldest of the team, a quiet technician with 18 years in wildlife response, and the one most familiar with this kind of terrain. The others didn't argue. No one tried to stop him. His expression was calm, his eyes steady, and that was all the confirmation anyone needed. As he descended toward the site, the mud gave beneath his boots in wet sighs, but he remained slow and deliberate. Every motion mattered. The cub saw him and froze, shoulders hunched, uncertain whether to flee or stay. Elias kept his gaze low and posture relaxed, offering no challenge, no threat. He curved wide, never approaching the cub directly, and began circling toward the side where the tree's weight seemed heaviest. From this angle, the full damage was clear. The log had dropped with incredible force, anchoring one end in the dirt behind her haunches, the other pressed firmly across her shoulder blades. The tree's trunk, slick with rain and blackened with rot along one edge, had formed a kind of natural vice. She had struggled at first. Claw marks lined the soil where her paws had dragged, but now she was still. Not unconscious, not gone, but enduring. Her ear twitched slightly as he approached. The only sign that she knew someone was near. He crouched carefully, his knees sinking into the moss, and began clearing debris. Broken branches, compacted leaves, and a strip of bark that had fused to her fur. As he worked, he murmured once, "It's okay, girl." The words were barely audible, meant more for rhythm than meaning. He didn't speak again. Minutes passed. The cub sat down near a cluster of ferns, watching. Elias switched tools, now using a hooked wedge to loosen the branches wedged underneath her ribcage. Each piece had to be removed without shifting the balance of the tree. One wrong move and the entire structure could collapse, crushing her completely or triggering a landslide across the loose soil. Above, one of the younger rangers checked the harness lines and gave a slight nod, still stable, still holding. Elias slipped a short steel brace beneath the log, placing it at an angle to relieve pressure, not to lift, just to shift weight fractionally. The mother bear exhaled sharply. Her shoulder moved, not much, just enough to tell him she wasn't paralyzed, just trapped, just exhausted. That tiny shift changed everything. The goal was no longer recovery, it was survival. If they could hold this moment long enough, just keep her breathing steady until backup arrived, they had a chance. Elias planted his right foot into the earth and dug a shallow trench near her spine. The soil was damp and resistant, but not frozen. He worked slowly, letting the shovel's edge carve a channel for air and blood to circulate. When he finished, he stepped back, not retreating, but giving her space. The cub stood again and crept toward her head. It pressed its nose to her muzzle and waited, body trembling with the strange tension of instinct and inexperience. Elias watched, motionless. Any sudden movement might panic them both. A soft gust of wind passed through the trees, carrying the scent of bark and damp needles, and with it, the stillness deepened. No machines, no sounds of rescue, just the weight of waiting. The mother's eyes opened now, fully, dull but alert. She did not rise, but her paw flexed slightly, curling into the soil. Another minute passed, then two, still alive, still holding. Elias lowered himself into a seated crouch, his back resting against a nearby root. The slope hadn't shifted. The net above remained secure. The bear wasn't free. But she was no longer dying. That distinction, small as it was, meant everything. Time had been bought, the moment had been extended. And in wildlife rescue, sometimes the difference between life and death isn't heroism or speed. It's silence, patience, and being willing to kneel quietly in the dirt beside something that might still survive. Elias didn't move again for a long time. He sat beside her while the forest pulsed around them, while the cub slowly curled at her side again. And while the first sounds of the approaching equipment echoed faintly in the trees far behind, the rescue had not yet ended, but something had already been saved. Elias moved as if the ground beneath him could vanish at any moment, each placement of his knee into the damp moss made with care, not just for his own balance, but for the fragile space between what he understood and what could not be predicted. The slope had grown quieter, as if the trees themselves were listening, and he felt every ounce of the weight above, not only the trunk of the ancient tree stretched across the bear's body, but also the unspoken truth that each movement he made could be the one that either gave her back her breath or stole it entirely. Her eyes were open now, dull but fixed, the glassy surface reflecting not alarm but exhaustion that had settled so deep it no longer had room for fear. Her head rested awkwardly, one ear half folded beneath her jaw. Muzzle pressed to earth soaked in her scent. The soft rise and fall of her ribcage remained, but shallow, almost imperceptible, as though her body had grown unfamiliar with the full depth of air. He kept his voice soft, so low it barely rose above the sound of insects flickering in the brush. "It's okay, girl." Not a command, not a comfort she would understand in language, but a tone, one meant to signal the absence of threat. The cub had circled around the far end of the trunk by now. weaving between ferns in a nervous loop, body stiff, head low, emitting only a single high-pitched huff as it watched the man edge closer to its mother's side. Elias didn't look toward it. He kept his gaze fixed downward, toward the crisscross of broken limbs pressed into her fur, where bark had gouged lines into her shoulder, and a thick knot of vine had cinched itself around her hindquarters like a noose. He assessed quickly, a habit formed from years of work in the field, but moved slowly, hands practiced in restraint, fingers nimble in the way only experience could teach. The saw he used was small and silent, a specialized tool meant for quiet interventions, and as the teeth bit into the first limb, the bear released a low sound, guttural and tired, more breath than voice. She didn't lift her head, she didn't growl again, but her paw twitched once, claws digging into the wet mulch beneath her. Elias took that as a message, not one of anger, but one of presence. She was aware. Still here, still holding on. One branch freed, then another. The work was painstaking, every shift in weight causing a new pressure to settle somewhere else on her massive body. The tree itself had likely fallen hours earlier, snapped by wind or storm or decay, a casualty of time rather than malice, but its collapse had come at just the wrong angle. Pinned at the shoulder and hip, she had no leverage, no way to roll or rise, only stillness, only waiting, and in that stillness, risk had multiplied. Internal injuries, crushed lungs, spinal trauma. Elias knew the possibilities and kept them in mind with every move. Another branch broke free, and he slid it behind him, never tossing, never breaking rhythm. A fly landed near the corner of the bear's eye, and she blinked, lashes heavy, then stilled again. Her breathing hitched once. Elias paused, waited. The cub came closer now, limbs unsteady, ears pinned flat to its skull. It crept just behind his right arm and made a soft, tentative noise, a murmur that rose only once and then disappeared. He let it be, let it find its way. He would not interfere unless it posed risk, and in this moment, it didn't. It just watched. A child beside its mother, uncertain where the lines of safety had gone. Elias turned his attention to the thickest limb pressing against her rib cage. It had splintered at both ends, but remained jammed between the log and a mound of roots, forming a natural lever that had locked her in place. If he cut this one wrong, the entire upper trunk might shift and collapse downward. The slope was still damp from the night's rain, the soil unstable. He signaled with a quiet movement of his hand, and above the rise, a second rescuer adjusted the tension line threaded around the far side of the tree. A low creak answered, old wood adjusting under strain, and Elias resumed. The blade bit slowly, and with each inch gained, he listened for change. The bear remained still. The cub exhaled a soft, rattling breath and pressed itself against her haunch, not playful, not panicked, just close, seeking contact in the absence of control. Elias made the final cut and eased the branch away. The tree groaned again. A handful of pine needles fell like rain from above, and he shifted backward quickly, expecting the upper trunk to sag, but it didn't. It held. For now. The pressure on her side eased. Her back leg extended slightly, toes splaying as blood flow returned, and Elias saw the tremor pass through her calf, a sign of nerves reawakening, of pain returning with sensation. That was good. That meant circulation. That meant hope. He reached forward once more, this time brushing away loose debris from her shoulder, revealing the dark patch of dried blood that had soaked into her fur. The wound wasn't deep, not life-threatening on its own, but it had gone unattended for hours, maybe more. An infection would come fast in heat and humidity. He would clean it later. First, she had to be free. Fully. Entirely. He rocked backward, signaling again to the team above. The tree would now need to be shifted carefully and slowly, using the rope pulley system to relieve the final pressure without causing a collapse. But for the moment, she was no longer pinned. She was no longer stuck, just weak, just tired, and yet alive. The cub lay down beside her now, its flank rising and falling in rhythm with hers. Elias didn't speak again. There was nothing more to say. The work was not done, but the most dangerous part had passed. All that remained was time, care, and stillness. And in the hush that followed, the forest breathed again, not in triumph, not in closure, but in recognition. 2 lives had not been lost, not yet, and that, in a place where wind carried both memory and warning, was enough. The forest held its breath as Elias moved into position once more, knees pressing into the slick soil, rope in hand, eyes fixed on the ridge where a second technician stood, braced against the counterpull system. Every movement up to this point had led to this moment. One last effort to shift the weight of the fallen trunk just far enough to give the bear a clean exit. She had not moved since the pressure eased hours earlier, her limbs still stiff, the lines in her face etched with quiet fatigue. Her cub remained close, pressed into the curve of her abdomen, eyes never leaving her flank. Time had passed without panic, but every minute she stayed beneath the timber was a gamble. Blood flow was returning, yes, but nerves, muscle tissue, and joint integrity hung in the balance. The tree was heavy with moisture, its bark softened by rot, yet its bulk had not given way. Now, with a final synchronized motion, Elias signaled up the hill. The pulley strained, the line tightened, and with one grounded pull and the strain of shoulders built from years of this work, he leaned into the rope and shifted his weight back. The log creaked, groaned, and moved, no more than a few inches, but enough. The release was not dramatic. It was quiet, a breath escaping the forest's throat, and in that silence, the bear stirred. First, a shudder down her spine, then the slow, halting drag of her left forelimb outward. Claws curling instinctively as her paw gripped the damp earth. She groaned, low and breathless, not in pain but in sheer effort, and Elias stayed perfectly still. Her back legs followed next, sluggish, uneven, trailing slightly as she pulled herself clear of the final curve of pressure. When her full frame came into view, the ridge of her spine trembled beneath the sagging muscle, her coat dark with soil and sweat, the fur at her shoulder thinned where bark had torn against it. She didn't run. She didn't roar. She simply paused, one leg extended, head low, nostrils twitching toward the man still crouched nearby. Her ears turned, first backward, then forward again. She blinked, slow and deliberate. Then she sat, not upright, not fully rested, but down enough to show she would not flee. The cub approached again, patting softly over pine needles and broken twigs, nudging into her ribs with a cautious nudge of its snout. She leaned into it slightly. It was the most she could offer. From the ridge, the technician radioed that the line had slackened. Elias didn't answer. He stayed still. Let the moment settle. The bear's side heaved again. Her breathing was deeper now, fuller. Her chest lifted with more confidence, and the groan of bone against bone had lessened. The risk was not over. She would need weeks to recover, maybe more if infection took hold. But she was no longer trapped, no longer waiting on the whim of wind, wood, or the clock. The work had left its mark, on her, on him, on the space around them, a clearing now stripped of illusion, raw and real in the early light. Birds returned first, calling gently from the treetops. Then the breeze resumed, threading through the canopy, stirring the ferns at the forest's edge. The bear blinked again, this time slower, as if committing the shape of the man to memory. Then she leaned forward, weight shifting tentatively to her uninjured side, and began to rise. The cub followed. No sound came from either one, only breath, only movement. Elias remained where he was, not rising, not reaching. He didn't need to. She had already chosen not to bolt. That was enough. Behind them, sunlight spilt across the moss in long, golden strokes. Dust hung still in the air, catching on a patch of quiet wind. And then they were gone, not in haste, but in gravity, each step a mark in the earth that would remain long after the forest closed in again. The forest had begun to reset itself. The tension that held every branch taut now loosening, leaf by leaf, until the wind returned to move gently through the clearing. The log that had pinned her was no longer touching her skin, and her breath, once shallow and labored, now moved with more purpose, not easy, but possible. Her limbs still quivered with strain, each step uncertain, but she had pulled herself clear, and the earth beneath her gave no further resistance. The cub, having watched every motion with nervous eyes, now pressed close to her hind leg, brushing its nose along the underside of her belly, unsure but seeking warmth. Elias, still crouched in the mud, didn't speak. He didn't move. His hands were open, resting in the grass beside him, palms up, signaling nothing but quiet and presence. The risk wasn't gone. Her injuries would require time, rest, and luck, but the most immediate danger had passed. There were no sharp cries, no triumphant sounds, and no chaos left to resolve. Just the slow process of life, remembering how to continue. Then, as the cub nudged once more and turned toward the woods, the mother lifted her head. Her body remained still, only her neck arching with slow effort, nostrils flaring as she inhaled deeply. Her eyes swept the clearing, then came to rest on the man who had approached her, not as a threat, but as a constant, present in her suffering, present in her stillness. And then, with no warning, no noise, no change in posture, she turned her head back to look at him. Not long. A breath's length, perhaps less, but it was deliberate, not instinctual, not rushed, a glance that did not ask for understanding but gave it. Her ears shifted forward for a moment, then fell back. She blinked. The cub looked too, mimicking her posture, gaze following hers without question. Elias held still. He did not interpret it. He did not reach for meaning. He simply let it happen. That moment, animal and human both paused. Not in confusion or threat, but in shared awareness, stretched into silence so deep even the birds did not interrupt it. Then, slowly, the mother turned again, nudged her cub forward with her snout, and began to walk. Not a sprint, not a stumble. A limp, yes, but with purpose. Her body moved with the strange elegance of something learning itself again. The cub followed closely, brushing against the curve of her side, sometimes trotting ahead and looking back, unsure of the pace, unsure of the path. But the direction was clear. Into the underbrush, into shadow, into the distance. No one followed, no one called out. The brush closed behind them, first around her legs, then her flank, her shoulders, her ears, until nothing remained but the faint sway of leaves and the hush of footsteps absorbed by the forest floor. Elias finally exhaled, slow and controlled. He did not stand yet. The work was finished, but the stillness remained. High above, branches moved softly against one another like a quiet breath drawn by the mountain itself. Somewhere to the east, a jay called once, sharp and distant. The grass around the fallen log caught the light in silver-green streaks, and the wind carried the scent of pine, damp bark, and soil newly disturbed. In the distance, far beyond where the eye could follow, the slow rustle of movement faded into stillness once more, not absence, but continuation. And in that silence, the forest remembered itself again. The slope was more forgiving now, the tension that had held every surface brittle, slowly yielding to the morning light as Elias began the slow, deliberate ascent up the ridge, his boots sinking slightly into damp moss softened by last night's rain. The clearing behind him, where the bear had lain and then risen, now felt like a different world, sealed by the brush, no longer calling for intervention. Each step was placed with care, not out of fear but respect, the kind born of knowing the weight of what had just occurred. He was halfway up when a rustle behind a thicket paused him mid-step, not urgent, not loud, but close. His hand hovered near his side, not to reach for anything, just to steady his own breath. The leaves shifted again, then parted. The cub emerged, not in a sprint, not in panic, but with a firm, slow gait that betrayed no hesitation. Its coat, damp in streaks along its sides, caught the slanting sun in patches. One ear flicked back, catching a fly. Its head stayed low, not submissive, but careful, scanning the slope and then settling on Elias, eyes dark and fixed. He didn't move. The cub took another step, then another. Not circling, not testing the air, just walking forward, steady and straight, until it stood not 5 paces from the man. Between them, the earth dipped slightly, grass pressed flat from earlier motion. The cub stopped there, planted its feet with unconscious confidence, and lowered its head, holding the position for a moment that did not stretch, did not waver. Then, just once, it lifted its chin and stared up at him, not defiant, not uncertain. Just a simple upward motion, the kind animals use when assessing something not yet understood. Elias breathed through his nose, steady and calm. His muscles remained soft, his shoulders stayed low. One gust of wind moved between them, brushing the cub's fur backward and lifting the edge of his jacket. Still, neither of them moved. It wasn't a standoff. There was no tension left in the space, only stillness. The cub's tail flicked once, then, with a quiet shift of its weight, it turned, not abruptly, but with a natural curve, and began walking back down the ridge, retracing the path its mother had taken, weaving between brush and uneven earth with light steps that made no more noise than falling pine needles. Elias remained still for a count of 4 breaths, then resumed his climb, each footfall echoing with more weight now, not because of fear, but because of what that moment meant. The risk remained. The cub was alone again, even if only briefly, and its movement suggested alertness but not alarm. He made a quiet note to mark its direction, to share with the others later where the mother may have paused, where shelter might lie. Above, the ridge broke into open sky. The treetops moved gently, their tips catching gold in the rising light, and behind him, already fading into the hush of branches closing again, the cub's path disappeared, not erased, but folded back into the rhythm of the forest. No sound followed, no cry, no growl. Only the hum of insects returning to the heat and the distant crackle of something alive moving through wild space. Elias stepped forward, one pace at a time, steady now, marked by what had passed but not burdened by it. Below, somewhere out of sight, the forest swallowed the trail, and above him, the ridge waited in silence. The wind had shifted, curling around the ridge in slow spirals that carried the scent of pine and the faint metallic trace of disturbed earth, and Elias remained still, one boot balanced against the incline, his weight suspended between movement and pause. Just ahead, no more than a dozen steps away, the cub lingered, its shape framed against the filtered light that pierced through the lattice of branches above. The forest had gone quiet again, no chirr of insects, no shuffle of birds in the canopy, only the subtle sound of leaves settling back into place after being stirred by small bodies passing through. The cub didn't approach this time, nor did it retreat. Its stance held something in between, a posture free of alarm but heavy with attention. Its ears were forward, tipped slightly to the sides, not in fear but in heightened awareness. Its breathing was visible in the slow rise and fall of its ribs, the motion barely perceptible unless watched closely. For a long moment, it stood like that, unblinking, eyes fixed on the man who had entered its world, not with dominance, but with presence. Calm, deliberate, unthreatening. Nothing about the cub's gaze asked for understanding, but everything about it held memory. The memory of weight lifted, of silence held during fear, of a mother who had once been pinned and was now free. The stakes, even now, remained unchanged. The mother was injured, the path back uncertain, and the cub, though not helpless, was vulnerable, too small to survive alone for long stretches without her. The risk was not spoken aloud, but existed in the stillness, in the way the cub's body stayed grounded yet poised, as though constantly calculating what was safe enough to observe. Elias did not move. He had long since learnt that observation was not passive. It was its own kind of presence, one that animals could read like a language. His arms remained loose at his sides, his chest rising with even measured breaths. The cub tilted its head slightly, not curiosity, but alignment. Then, just once, it lowered its gaze and released a soft, almost imperceptible sound. It was not a whimper or a growl, just a quiet vibration, like a hum pressed into the air and left there to settle. The kind of sound that didn't seek response, only acknowledgement. Elias heard it, not with his ears alone, but with his entire frame, as if it had been placed in the air between them as a mark, not a message. A nod that was not physical, but shared. Then, with the same smoothness as before, the cub turned, not quickly, but with fluid certainty, and moved through the undergrowth, parting fern and twig, each paw step landing without sound. It didn't run, it didn't look back. The brush absorbed it in seconds. What was left was not noise or echo, but a quietness that grew wider with each passing moment. Elias remained there a while longer, eyes on the last place the cub had been. Around him, the world returned in pieces, the chirp of a nuthatch overhead, the the breeze pushing softly through cedar tips, the far-off call of something moving farther downslope. The ridge behind him waited. So did the trail, and the memory of what had passed would travel with him. But this silence, this small nod of the forest acknowledging something quietly witnessed, held its own weight. And when he finally stepped forward again, it was not to chase or follow, but to leave the space as it had been offered. Whole, still, and now just slightly changed. Image prompt. A misty mountain slope during early morning light, a weathered male wildlife ranger, Elias, in mud-streaked gear standing still on a narrow forest trail. In front of him, a small grizzly bear cub, damp fur glistening, stands calmly with one paw slightly forward, head low, eyes locked onto the ranger. The cub's head is then lifted slightly in a silent gesture. The background shows moss-covered trees, broken branches, and distant snowfall clinging to higher ridges. The mood is solemn, respectful, and still, with soft fog weaving between trunks. Cinematic wildlife documentary style, high realism, soft lighting, 4K photo quality, man risks life to save. Trapped bear. Then, the cub did something no one expected.